Around 18 years ago, my wife Regina and I lived in Boston for a period of time. It was in the midst of seminary. We were in seminary in Tennessee, and in the midst of that process, we were required to get off the seminary campus and head into the world to serve in some sort of challenging setting. So I chose to work at a very massive, large downtown homeless shelter just off of Boston Common. The shelter was in a rugged part of town, and during daylight hours, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people in all sorts of conditions congregated in or just outside the multi-story shelter building. And although just a few blocks away, marble-floored office buildings and the Ritz-Carlton were there, the shelter was the scene of utter despair, flowing body fluids, knife fights, and worse. My job on the surface was pretty simple. It was simply to hang out and build relationship with folks in the shelter, in Boston Common, and in all the back nearby alleys. The goal was simply to be a stable presence in the lives of those who had no solid ground to stand on, and maybe, just maybe, encourage a person to take the risk of venturing into the shelter for some food or to receive some kind of social service. Well, one day when I happened to be in the area, in the shelter in which food was served, my mentor, Franciscan brother, said, "Robert, I'd like for you to say a prayer to all those that are gathered here today eating." I looked at him like he was nuts, but I agreed. And as I began to pray, I was basically ignored with one exception. A nearby man bowed his head as I spoke. And despite all the noise, the yelling, and the fact that nobody else was paying attention, this man seemed to be paying attention to every word I said. And when I finished, he motioned me. And I sat down next to him. He looked at me and he said, "You're full of it, man. You are just full of it." And then he launched into every imaginable expletive and cutting remark he could think of, none of which I'm going to repeat. So I walked away with my tail between my legs, and I felt very defeated, and I was upset. And then I began to ponder all of the outrageous things that he said to me. And then I felt worse until I thought to myself, maybe I need to pay attention not just to the message, but the messenger. And I said to myself, I've learned, Robert, that you have to let a lot of things go in life, especially if the person sending the message has their own issues going on, is projecting their own stuff on me, or is just plain nuts. You got to let that go. So I felt better for a while. But later that night, I asked myself a very troubling question. I don't know why I asked it, but I did. And I said, what if, despite the messenger, there's a message for me to pay attention to? A lesson to be learned in the midst of his outrageous comments. Well, I still believe it's important for all of us to be cautious about whose messages we take to heart. But despite that, there was a lesson for me to remember despite the man's surface conduct. And the message that I took away that day from him was, Robert, for God's sakes, get over yourself. Don't take yourself seriously. Ministry has no room for an ego. And remember, Robert, there's a tiny, fine line ever present between you and people living on the street. Well, while there's much more to that story and many other lessons I learned, what I want to focus on this morning is a very interesting truth in life. And that is that I've learned that sometimes there might just be something to be learned from what on the surface seems to be totally outrageous. There can even be nuggets of wisdom embedded in that which is appalling. And if we simply consistently reject something because it feels way out there or because the messenger is way out there, we might, in fact, miss something important. Jesus' life, he was kind, compassionate, forgiving, insightful, loving, an amazing teacher, challenged things that needed to be changed, an extraordinary healer, a savior, all the other things we know about him. But if you study Jesus' life as described in the Gospels, Gospels that in fact reflect the way things actually happened, like the resurrection, sometimes in the Gospels, Jesus throws a real zinger. In fact, once in a while, Jesus seems to say things that seem so outrageous and out of character that it's hard to believe that he would say such a thing. And there are places in the Bible, in the Gospels, in which I have asked myself, did Jesus really say that? Doesn't seem to be the Jesus I know. So this morning, just for fun, do a little bit something different. I want to touch briefly on some seemingly outrageous things Jesus said. In fact, the words I want to get into sometimes seem so out of character that when a lot of people read these stories, they want to quickly dismiss them because they seem harsh and cruel. But, and this is really important, if we don't dig deeper into the seemingly outrageous things Jesus said, we might miss out on some very important lessons for us to reflect upon, ponder, and incorporate into our own faith lives. So let's jump in. One of my favorites is from Matthew 15. Jesus is hanging out with his disciples. They're totally burned out. They're exhausted. They needed a break. They get away from it all. They're a long way from Jerusalem. They needed breathing room. They'd been doing all this teaching and healing, and they were just wiped out. In the midst of this, they're gathered. They're chilling out. They're relaxing. A non-Jewish woman approaches the disciples and says, "Please, please, please help me. My daughter is possessed by a demon and I don't know what to do. It's just cruel to see what she's going through. Please help me." Jesus didn't say a thing, but his disciples said to Jesus, "Send this woman away. She's being a pain. She's crying out to us. She's bothering us. She's driving us nuts." Jesus says, no, don't worry. I'm here only to help ourselves here, our own people. And then the woman fell on her knees and begged Jesus, "Jesus, have mercy on me. My daughter is suffering." And then get this. This is what Jesus says to the heartbroken, despairing mother. "Woman, it's not right to take bread out of a child's mouth and throw it to the dogs like you." What? Did Jesus really say that? Yes. But how could he call a suffering woman a dog? It's outrageous. Well, frankly, I think that it's quite possible, as I have struggled with this story for years, I think it's quite possible Jesus' intent was to shock people who heard him speak. And while Jesus does eventually heal the woman's daughter, as I ponder this story, I don't think the story is so much about the woman and her extraordinary faith and her persistence and her courage and her daughter, although it is certainly about those things. I think the story has a lot more to do with Jesus' disciples. You see, in the story, when the woman asks for help, mercy, and healing, it is the disciples who immediately send her away. It is they who are being hard-hearted. It is they, because of their exhaustion, were wanting to ignore her. They who, in fact, were exhibiting a prejudicial attitude toward a non-Jew. And so I have to wonder if Jesus made, in fact, such an outrageous, shocking, over-the-top thing, actually to show his disciples what they looked and sounded like through their behavior and their actions. It would be like me being in front of a group of pastors and using the N-word in front of them, in front of a group of pastors who were prejudicial, to show them how they sounded and were coming across. It's a bold approach, but then Jesus was bold, and he would be very bold and very pointed in his remarks sometimes when he needed to make a very important point. And I believe, as I ponder this story and pray about it, that Jesus' point is that an exclusive, hard-hearted, mean-spirited attitude toward outsiders, or those who are different, culturally or in some other way, is in fact what is outrageous and has no place in the lives of those that follow Jesus. And Jesus, as I said, made this point by being outrageous himself to show what such over-the-top behavior looks like. He certainly got their attention and ours. Or a story from Matthew today. I'll paraphrase it very briefly. We need to remember the setting. Jesus is surrounded by some very uptight religious people, some Pharisees, some priests, some clergy that were very full of themselves. And they had been attacking Jesus for not being pious. Jesus, I can't imagine you would say such words. You're supposed to be holy. How could you act that way, Jesus? You're supposed to be holy. Jesus, what's wrong with you? You really don't understand. They were attacking Jesus. And so Jesus tells this parable in response to a crowd that is after him. We need to remember that point. And Jesus, in essence, says, I've heard what you said, but let me tell you about the life I'm offering you. And the life I'm offering you is something like this. A king decided to throw a wedding banquet for his son. The problem is that none of the invited guests came. So the king sent his servants out to ask the guests in person to show up for the party. They still didn't show up. The king was not happy. So the king then decided to invite everyone to the party, not just those on the original invitation A list. So lots of people came. And as the party was happening, the king noticed a guy who was not dressed properly for the event. So the king said, tie the guy up and ship him to hell. Get him out of here and don't let him back in. And so that's what the servants did. Well, when the people that had just been attacking Jesus hear this, they are even more furious at Jesus because they know he's telling a story about them. They even begin, the scriptures tell us, to look for ways to get rid of Jesus. Now, there's lots going on here, but what shocks and disturbs me is the story seems to be saying that if somebody's not dressed right, they're going to hell where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. What's that? Did Jesus really say that? Well, yeah, he did. But we have to go past the surface outrageousness, I believe, to get at the point. And I believe as I think about this story that Jesus was trying to make 2 points. First, it was to the people who were self-righteous and anybody who is religious and self-righteous. Jesus is saying, in essence, don't be so self-impressed. Don't be cocky. Don't think you are more important or more special than those who are not as religious as you. In fact, if you act that way, if you act in such a self-impressed way as you're acting, it's like being invited to a special, wonderful event by God and not even bothering to RSVP or show up. Jesus was equating the Pharisees with people who have such a dismissive attitude. He was saying, get over yourselves. Start appreciating God, not your religiosity. Well, what about the guy who was tossed out? In Scripture, it is a critical mistake to take one phrase and one verse and ignore the bigger corpus. It is clear through the Gospels over and over and over and over and over again that Jesus doesn't care about attire. It is clear what he cares about is a person's heart, not their outward appearance. It is clear that Jesus seeks the lost and seeks those who are on the margins and seeks out every human being to have a relationship with him. That is a core theme. Jesus, it is clear in the Gospels, invites everybody to the party, just like in the parable. The party of a new life, a life of purpose and meaning, a life of forgiveness and love, a life of direction and clarity, a life of service, a life of putting God first, a life of joy and wonder and excitement, a life filled with adventure like a great wedding banquet. Well, what was Jesus' point of all this to the people who were attacking him? I think he was saying, That faith is not just about a relationship with God, it's about having a relationship that actually changes your life. Our faith, Jesus was saying, is supposed to transform who we are from the inside out. Who we are, how we think, how we act and relate. And our faith doesn't change us. What good is it? Our lives should be an outward reflection of our faith, much like a wedding guest should outwardly reflect his gratitude for being included and invited to the party. But in the story, we know the guy showed up without any outward change. And Jesus is not trying to be mean in this parable. He wants to be clear that everyone is invited to a new life through him. And he's clearly challenging those who are religious to get over themselves. And boy, did he get their attention with this story. We know where it leads, to the cross. A couple other very fast stories. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, beautiful words. Chapter 5. These gorgeous words are happening. And then Jesus, seemingly out of nowhere, says, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, Jesus says, cut it off. Throw it away. Jesus has just been saying, blessed are the peacemakers. I mean, where did this come from? Wow. Did Jesus really say this? Well, yes. Did any of these phrases sound familiar to you? I've told you 1,000,000 times. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse. He's as skinny as a toothpick. She has a ton of money. Her brain is the size of a pea. While some of these phrases may be familiar, are they literally true? No. Nobody has a brain the size of a pea. Well, maybe a few people. No. And it is not likely that any of us has said anything 1,000,000 times. Instead, they are exaggerations, aren't they, to make a point? What are these called? It's called hyperbole. And Jesus was a master at hyperbole to make a point, a serious point. Did Jesus expect anyone to literally cut off a body part due to sin? Of course not. That would be ridiculous. But what is not silly is sin itself. Jesus, in essence, is saying, look, when you blow it, like we all do, sometimes you need to take it really seriously. Sometimes you really need to get at the root causes of what's going on with you that compelled you to take that action. Sometimes you really need to make some changes in life. Not because I'm angry at you or I spite you, but I want you to change. Sometimes you need to get help. Sometimes your sin points you to that reality. Be honest with yourself and others. Turn to God. Jesus says sin hurts you. No one feels good when they're off the mark. So please deal with it and don't minimize it. Notice in the story, however, that Jesus did not say, go around and cut body parts off of other people. I hear a lot of body parts being cut off through words in our village recently. His words were all about looking at ourselves, not how others are sinning. This is why Jesus used another hyperbole when he said, pay attention to the wooden plank in your own eye, not the speck in your neighbor's. Beautiful point, but hyperbole. And then finally, Luke 14. There's a large group of people around Jesus, and Jesus says these words. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, hate his wife and children, hate his brothers and sisters, yes, hate even his own life, he or she cannot be my disciple. Did Jesus really say that? Yes. But we need to look below the surface. Again, Jesus is using a bit of hyperbole to make a point. But more than that, we really need to look at the word hate that Jesus is using. And some of you know this. Hate is a lousy translation of the word that Jesus used. The word Jesus used here that is translated hate has in fact nothing to do with emotional or psychological hatred. It's not what it's about. Rather, the word has to do with commitment and priority. Jesus is saying, if you want to be my disciple, then I must be your priority over everything and everyone else. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily makes it easier, but it certainly changes how we hear the story. This is what I believe Jesus was getting at. And I'm going to use a metaphor that I use with couples who are getting married. Often when I'm standing before a couple, I say to them, the most important thing you can do in your relationship is invest most of your energy and your time in your relationship with God. Before each other, before work, before anything else, your relationship with God. Priority. And then what I like to do, I have my grandmother's old triangle, dinner triangle that you would ring. And I'll often say to a couple, picture a triangle. You two are on either side of the triangle, and God is the third point of the triangle. Here you are, apart from one another. But what's really interesting is that if you each work hard and diligently on your own relationship with Christ, and you work to become closer and closer and closer to Christ, look what happens to your relationship. You become closer than you could otherwise be by putting God first. And I believe that what Jesus was saying is that discipleship is not only about giving up, sacrificing, putting God first, but that in fact, as a result of that we come to have a much deeper and closer and loving relationship with people around us. I believe Jesus meant all of this and more. Wow, these 4 stories, getting rid of prejudicial attitudes and not letting busyness, fatigue, or presumptions get in the way of caring for somebody. Not taking ourselves so seriously and living a life that reflects faith, shows our faith. Doing something about our own sin when it happens, not brushing it under the carpet. Putting Christ first in every relationship. Just samples of what we learn from Jesus' outrageousness. Sometimes the outrageous, the unpleasant, the over the top, and the appalling. Sometimes what doesn't feel very good or sound quite right at first. Sometimes the most unexpected people. Sometimes the most unexpected places and experiences. Sometimes from all of that, outside of the words of Christ, but sometimes from all of that comes some of life's great lessons and nuggets of wisdom. This was certainly the case with regard to some outrageous things Jesus said. Things I'm sure people did not want to hear because it seems so over the top. But I also believe that sometimes God uses what is far out of our own comfort zones to teach us things we each need to hear. That's why it's essential that we be very careful about what we dismiss. I will always be grateful to that guy in Boston about teaching me to get over myself, in spite of the fact that he communicated with me in ways I didn't really appreciate. I still may not like what he said or how he said it, but he was speaking for God, and he was a great teacher. I learned a lot. And my hunch is that as you reflect back on your own life, you may have had such moments or teachers as well. And so for a few moments, as Paul just plays some music, I'd like to invite each of us to think about Jesus, how he's sometimes taught, and also ponder some of the lessons we've learned from unexpected places and people, even from the outrageous and over the top.